Good morning and welcome to part 9 of my Women Who Run with the Wolves series by Dr. Clarissa Pinkola Estes. So today we're going to be talking about coming home and returning to oneself. So to start, the author in this chapter gives us another Inuit tale, and this one is about a man who's extremely lonely. He is so lonely that his tears have literally carved cracks into his skin. One night, he comes across this beautiful group of women naked on a pile of rocks, and they're laughing and dancing together. And he sees that they have a pile of sealskin pelts, so he steals one. So at the end of the night, all of these women go to return to the sea because they're not just women, they're also seals, except for one woman whose pelt was stolen by the man. She asks the man for it back, but he refuses and asks her to be his wife. She initially says no because she's not like him. She is other and lives beneath the waves. The man then asks her to stay with him for 7 summers, and at the end of the 7th summer, she can do as she pleases. So she agrees. So they end up having a child, and one night the child hears them arguing. Lo and behold, it's actually her 8th winter there, and she wants to go home. The man refuses and runs away. The woman is barely alive at this point now. Her skin is drying out and cracking. She can barely see, and the child hears this voice from the sea calling to him. So he follows the voice and he finds the stolen pelt, and he also finds an old seal. So he ends up giving the pelt back to his mother, who returns to the waves and takes the child with her. The old seal is actually revealed to be her father, and he asks her how it was on the surface. And she says that she heard a man, and this man who gave his everything to be with her, but she knew that she couldn't stay because she would end up being a prisoner. The child and the seal live this beautiful life under the sea for about a week before he's sent back to the surface because it's not his time to be with them yet. So when I first read this story, honestly, it actually made me cry because the seal woman recognizes just how much she hurt the man. And even though she knows that he gave her everything that he had, she knew that she couldn't stay with him. It wasn't her place. And I feel like I've been through something similar, and so it really touched me to be reminded of that. I understood that plight that she went through, where she knew she wasn't meant to be above. She was meant to be in a different place, and she just couldn't give him what he wanted. And honestly, I think that's something that a lot of women can relate to. I think it happens more often than we think, where we kind of end up giving up parts of our lives for other people. And the author talks about this. She talks about how we're not bad and we're not stupid for this happening. We're just naive, and we'll remain naive until we're kind of shaken out of that scenario. So the author also says that there's a process to this situation, that there's a path to knowing. And it starts with us being unaware. It starts with us being naive and then being tricked and then finding our way back to our own power and finding our way back home. She talks about how when we are away from our power and away from home, we eventually tire, kind of like what happened to the seal woman. We lose sight of who we are. We aren't taking care of ourselves. We are sort of fading away. We have had our own pelt stolen. And when we end up slowly fading away, we sort of end up lost in a fog. So one of the things the author really talks about too that stuck out to me is when she talks about returning to ourselves. We have to recognize that we are not in connection with ourselves, and we end up being called back. And when we're called back, that can either be by people in our lives who recognize that we're not in a great situation. It could be through us realizing that, or somehow some sort of ancient knowledge that kind of exists within us that kind of awakens us and reminds us that we need to be called back. The author also talks about how the hardest part of that whole journey when it comes to returning to home isn't the journey itself, it's the actual leaving. And that was something that I really related to, because when I was in a situation like that, making that decision to leave was the hardest part. It's hard because you almost feel like you created this situation, so you feel like you have to stay, but you also know that you can't. The author also spends a lot of time talking about going home, and when she says going home, she really doesn't mean it in a physical sense as much as she means kind of nurturing ourselves and our souls. So we do this through our hobbies, our spiritual journeys, resting, things like that. And when we as women get so battered down by negative situations, we spend less and less time at home. We end up in unhappy marriages, jobs where we don't feel fulfilled, things like that. Those are the things that drain us and take us away from that idea of home. And if we don't take the time to step away from that, that's when we end up falling into that deterioration period. So she talks about combating this by kind of pre-planning times to go home, times to take rest, and take times to devote to our hobbies. One of the interesting things that she talked about too is she talks about how this happens a lot to mothers because we are kind of taught to sacrifice so much for our children. And while that's noble, I say our children, I don't have any children, but while that is noble, it's kind of a double-edged sword. Because on one hand, yes, I think there is somewhat beauty in the sacrifice, but at the same time, we are teaching our children to do the same thing when they grow up, and we kind of continue this unhealthy cycle. We still have to allow time for ourselves too. We cannot give up all of ourselves for other people, our lovers, our children, our family. We have to take time for ourselves. The thing too is the author also talks about intentional solitude as a way of healing and connecting to our inner self. One of the things I really liked is she theorizes that part of women being cranky right before their period is because women have been deprived of that alone time to reset ourselves and heal. Because back in time in other cultures, women were actually kind of sent away during their periods, and women would use this as a chance to recharge and reconnect with themselves and the earth and their inner selves. She also says that practicing intentional solitude isn't necessarily this like great feat that needs to be accomplished. She says that it only takes honestly like a minute a day. It's sort of like tuning out, taking a minute to completely push out the world and kind of sit with yourself and your soul. So overall, she kind of ends the chapter by saying we can't live this confiscated life no matter how much we think we can or we want to or we think we can endure it. Because there's this inner part of ourself deep down that knows that it's not right and calls for us to free ourselves. And we eventually do have to go home.